Hi, everyone. I'm Hanovi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator for Redwind Consulting, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including but not limited to housing and homeless services, children and youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you are interested, you can contact me at the email I will be putting into the chat box. As this states, this presentation is not necessarily representative of the views and policies of the DOJ or OVW. All the opinions and recommendations within are those of the authors. Presenting with us today are Victoria Ybanez and Hope Wenke. Victoria Ybanez is the Executive Director of Redwind Consulting, Inc. from 2005 to present, which she developed, and she has been working to end violence against American Indian and Alaskan Native women for 35 years. She has a depth of experience working closely with tribes and developing and implementing a range of responses to violence against Indigenous women, and she has conducted numerous site visits and has facilitated sessions and trainings for tribes for over the past 20 years. She has experience working intertribally as well as within a tribe's local culture, and she has been coordinating and providing tribal technical assistance for recipients of the Tribal Government's Program for the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Violence Against Women, as stated, for the last 20 years. She has also developed Redwind's National Tribal Advocate Center, providing 40-hour domestic violence training institutes and 40-hour sexual assault training institutes, and she developed the curriculum for each training and serves as lead faculty. Hope Wenke is an enrolled member of the Omaha Tribe of Nebraska. She works as the project coordinator to the Responses for Urban Native Programs project that provides training and technical assistance on improving victim services and justice responses for American Indian and Alaskan Native populations residing within urban areas. The project has a focus on addressing the unique challenges experienced by Native victims and improving coordination and service provision between both non-tribal and tribal organizations. She has also worked within Redwind's Hisseya Advocate Program as an advocate and program director. The Hisseya Advocate Program is a local Native program working to address violence against Native survivors of domestic and sexual violence through direct services in Colorado Springs, Colorado. As project coordinator, Hope provides assistance tailored to the needs of urban programs, facilitates work sessions, provides assistance within planning, develops strategies, grows culturally centered responses for urban natives, and works to provide these responses to Native victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, dating violence, and stalking. And she develops the materials to enhance urban Native responses. Before we begin, if you have any questions or comments, you can put them into the chat box, and I will now turn it over to our presenters.
Thanks, Hanovi. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the United States is currently facing a crisis that's unknown by many. According to the United States Department of Justice, 56.1% of Native women have been victim of sexual violence, and Native American women are 2.5 times more likely to have been raped or sexually assaulted than any other woman in the United States. And they're also more likely to suffer sexual assault by multiple partners. I read an article, I believe it was from Brigham Young University, and they had done an interview. They were interviewing different Native communities, and they had reported that not one woman they had spoken to was not a survivor of sexual assault. That means that every single person they had interviewed had experienced sexual assault at some point in their life. And those survivors that they interviewed ranged from age 10, she was a great granddaughter, to a great grandmother that was the age of 90. So why are these statistics so elevated among Native American women? It reminds me of a story that I heard about a young woman that was raped and beaten, basically left there by herself. It happened on her reservation. She was later found by her friend, who then transported her to the Indian Health Center, and they immediately sent her to an urban hospital. Um, the survivor, I guess not the survivor, the victim, she did pass away 2 weeks later, and they had found out that she had intended to attempt suicide by taking whatever pill she could find as a result of that sexual assault. Um, After her passing, the family and friends had went to the police officers to kind of investigate and see where the case had been. And they were informed that the case was closed. There wasn't even an open case in regards to their family member and friend. And the perpetrator walked free. And unfortunately for survivors, many of the times they receive different responses depending on, whether the victim is Native or whether the perpetrator or the accused is a member of the federally recognized tribe. And it depends on where the crime took place, whether it was on tribal land or not. Another reason for elevated statistics is under-resourcing of law enforcement agencies and services available for the victim. Failure to hold those accountable are also a reason for the statistics, and that's because the complex interrelations between tribal, state, and federal courts. This has resulted in Native women continuing to experience high levels of assault, which strips their dignity, security, and doesn't provide them justice. Many of the times when a woman walks into a Native-run clinic or a health center, they are to get a post-exam or a rape kit, she's more than likely turned down due to the underfunding or the appropriate training for those services. And without proper medical care, a rape kit, and other resources, it makes it really hard for the victim to take the case to trial. Sexual violence is also seen as normalized or being normal rather than a crime, as many women do not seek justice because they know that no action is going to be taken. I think another reason would be colonization of the Native people and lands also, as sexual violence is so prevalent among Native American women and children, as they are the most vulnerable to the violence. And Native women deserve to live a life free of violence. Next slide. So women, by virtue of her gender, are sacred. The stories of creation differ from tribe to tribe, but most equate to how Native Americans, the Native American way of life, understands the whole world is sacred. Family is sacred, earth is sacred, and all the life has meaning, and it's all interconnected. In the sacred circle of unity, women are seen as beautiful and powerful because they are the givers of sacred life. They're both grounded to Mother Earth and connected to the Father Sky by bringing children into the world through their power of life and the giving of love. In various tribes, this honor and respect was evident in the way in which Native women were active and influential in political, spiritual, religious, and economic spheres. Next slide. So the impact of sexual violence. Not only is abuse physical harm, but the abuse is traumatic and can impact the victim emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. The National Sexual Assault Resource Center research shows that survivors of sexual assault are 10 times more likely to attempt suicide than those who haven't experienced sexual assault. And also, according to the Center for Disease Control, suicide is the second leading cause of death among college students. So it's crucial for advocates to really be aware of suicide when providing those services. Sexual violence, with the impacts of sexual violence, can be long-term and short-term. It can be overall health and well-being. It can be common emotional reactions that include guilt, shame, fear. They can be in shock. Also, many people have feelings of isolation when they're after sexual assault. And those are, as an advocate, again, I think it's crucial to look for some of those behaviors in a victim. There's also the psychological effects that sexual assault impacts, and that has been linked to more of the long-term health risks. These effects aren't always the easiest to deal with and usually really hard for the victim to navigate. So it's really important that they're able to find the right help and the support so that those can be managed. Next slide. Act as a biased supporter of victims experience or who have experienced sexual violence. Advocates are responsible to assist each survivor in their healing process. Advocacy alone isn't just providing a safe shelter or financial assistance for victims. As an advocate, it's important for the survivor to understand that they didn't do anything wrong, they didn't or weren't the cause of the abuse. And as an advocate, you should help the victim with their self-determination and autonomy. You know, the key role for the advocate is to give voice, make sure that the survivor is feeling heard, listen and believe the victim, and don't investigate or judge the victim. Always advocate for the survivors, expressed interests, including resources to regain control over their lives. Creating a sister space and providing support and using and working with these systems are important factors in making the survivors' voices heard, which allows the victim to heal. And advocates should provide expertise founded on Native victims' experiences with injustice, social services, and medical systems. Be sure to build those partnerships and educate one another. Prioritize victim safety and offender accountability in all aspects of advocacy. Safety plan with the survivor. As I had talked about earlier, we know the impact of sexual violence. Make sure that you're safety planning with that victim as well. Planning needs to be include what is a survivor going to do if they're triggered. Make sure that they have different techniques to utilize with handling different situations. And lastly, you always want to maintain victim confidentiality. Next slide. So our work as an Indigenous advocate, traditional healing options, as we know, are the most effective resource for healing. Think of the trauma a survivor experiences, and we know that it's appropriate for them to seek maybe therapy services and other work. But what we do know is that having them be connected to their culture, different ceremonies, and Native practices is also key for the survivor to heal. As Indigenous advocates, we will be those resources. As part of sexual assault, the victim's identity is basically attacked, and a sense of who they are is gone as a man or a woman. And so working with being able to have the survivor work with other Native survivors or different groups, having that advocate support also helps them provide a sister space. We have HSEA Advocate Program. It's a Native specific program under Red Wind Consulting here in Colorado Springs. And the advocates at HSEA make creating a sister space a priority for the survivor's healing process. As the advocate works with the woman who's coming into the program, the advocate thinks of the survivor as a relative. How would you treat your relative? You treat them by embracing them with support and comfort. Making sure that the survivor is okay and feels dignity about being there and receiving your services. You want to make sure that you're not, she's not having to feel shame. Indigenous advocates help to work with the survivor to connect back to their culture. With the Hasia Advocate program, the advocates, they've actually worked hard, really hard, by making that sister space. The participants they engage in traditional or cultural options for healing and recovery from the violence. In the space, they've got a Indigenous healing garden. And in that space, they hold women's groups. They have traditional healing medicines and also a sweat lodge. Another thing that they do is they have traditional healing kits that include medicines such as cedar, sweetgrass, and that's used for smudging. So survivors can that can help them with like grounding techniques as well if they're triggered. And as we know that medicines are really how us Native people heal our spirit, our body, and our body. I'm going to pass it on to Vicki if you have any additional comments about our work as Indigenous advocates.
Thanks, Hope. And listening to the way you talked about it, I really appreciate that, because I think that when we think about advocacy, people often make assumptions about what they think advocacy is. And particularly what's really critical when we're talking about Native victims of sexual assault, our Indigenous advocates are really central to that healing process. And when you were talking, what came to my mind was one thing that oftentimes when somebody's living with trauma, that they can't sometimes they don't necessarily see the options that are available to them. So the advocates themselves, help out by identifying ways that they can care for themselves. Such as an example, Hope mentioned about when a survivor has a reoccurrence of the trauma, something happens and it brings the trauma forward for them, that in that process, then one of the things that's really critical is for them to have some ways that they can manage that so that they can come back into a safe space for themselves. And just a simple example, so I know for myself, for being in sweat lodge, is that when it gets really hot, I've been given cedar to put into my hand and to breathe the cedar, and it's really grounding, and it helps me to deal with the heat. It also can be really grounding as a part of dealing with the trauma impact, that in the moment, being able to have something that simple that might feel really obvious to somebody who's not in trauma, but a Native advocate or an Indigenous advocate can offer that suggestion and even provide that cedar to those victims to help them have simple options to be able to ground themselves in the moment. And so it's the other thing to me when I think about being an Indigenous advocate is that as Native people in crisis, now is not the time to educate your non-Native counterparts. Now is not the time to teach them what it means to work with a Native victim, and to understand what might be the best healing options and the best supports for me. So, and while a Native advocate may not know every tribe and the way every tribe's culture is and what the different supports are, they'll have enough understanding that through different suggestions and guidances they'll give, that they can offer, that individual victim or survivor can use those suggestions to help them identify what might be helpful within their own cultural identities. So I think our Indigenous advocates are critical in the work that we do. Next slide. So just talking a little bit more detailed about some of the role of the advocate. Many people make assumptions about what advocates do, and that's mostly because people are looking from the outside in and don't fully know the comprehensive work that advocates are involved in. So when we think about that comprehensive work, that we're really working to make sure that this victim moves from being a victim to a survivor to a person that's thriving in the community. And it's not something that's going to happen overnight. So when we think about what the word advocate means, it means to give voice. And so as a part of that, as an advocate, we're creating an environment for that particular person who experienced the sexual violence to be able to assert their rights, to communicate and have their voice heard. And as a part of that, if that's not happening, the advocate can step in and help open those doors, help get people to listen, help to make sure that that voice is being heard. I think about some of the advocacy that I have done, and there have been times that I've worked with a survivor, and I've sat there and we're getting ready to go meet with somebody, whether it's a therapist or whether it's to go file a police report or to go talk with the prosecutor after cases in process. And in that time of meeting with that survivor and that victim, that person, I've asked them, what do you want to have happen here? And get them to start identifying that and talking about that. And then ask them, so what if you forget something, or at what point do you want me to help, or do you want me to help? And so we talk about that as well, so that we are well planned before we go into a meeting, so that when that survivor reaches a point where they no longer have the words, or they feel like they're not being heard, or they just have, the trauma is they're experiencing that, or they need some help, then we've already worked out, how do I step in? Do I step in and speak on their behalf? Do I step in and ask for a break? Do I step in and, in that break, offer them some cedar or some sage or tobacco or pollen, whatever it is that they might need in terms of their indigenous ways. So there's multiple things that I can do. And part of that is that I work in partnership with that survivor. So it's not me calling all the shots. We talk about it as autonomy, which basically means that that person who has experienced that violence, they're the ones who's making the decisions. My job is to help them to have informed decisions. They can make informed decisions in that process, and I can help guide them through thinking about pros and cons in the situation. What are the potential consequences? What could be the potential backlash? And helping them to know, so that when they make the decision, they have enough information. We can't figure out everything, but we want to make sure they have enough information. So with that, as an advocate, we're working across multiple systems. We're working across medical systems. And in that process, we're helping that person to make sure that they're medically sound. Oftentimes, a victim will think that if they walked away from it, they're okay. Not realizing that there could be internal injuries, there could be different kinds of injuries that they have experienced on their body, and need some attention. And a trained professional, as a medical provider, particularly a forensic examiner, is going to be one of the best options for them. Hope mentioned the rape kit previously. And so when we think about a rape kit, or also known as a forensic exam, oftentimes people think about that as a survivor goes in and it's about collecting evidence. That's only one part of that process. First and foremost is about that person coming in, seeking an exam, seeking medical attention, is to make sure they're medically sound. That's the priority of that forensic exam. Secondary is if that survivor wants to engage in a process of the forensic exam for the collection of evidence, then they can participate in that. So that's not the first part of it. And then in that medical response, making sure that that survivor, their needs are being met in the process. So we know with our Indigenous victims of sexual assault, based on different traditional beliefs and values and teachings, that some people may not want evidence to be removed from their body, or if they do, they want it back after it's been looked at. And so we as advocates need to understand that to be able to advocate on behalf of that person within that medical system to make sure their needs are being met. And then we're there for emotional support and trauma support to help make sure that if we see that they're getting more overwhelmed, to make sure that there's a break in there, make sure that any of the outside concerns that they might have might be that can be addressed, such as maybe they've got children, and what we know about forensic exams is that they can last a few hours to up to a long day, and that particular person may have other things they're concerned about. So maybe we can make phone calls to make sure their children are, are with their grandmother or with a friend, or maybe I can call their work and let them know that she's not coming in. Different kinds of things like that. So that particular victim of sexual violence can stay engaged in what's happening without being worried about these external things. The legal processes can be quite complex. And when we think about legal processes, we're talking about making a report to law enforcement. And through that initial report, there may be follow-up interviews that take place. And then from that, if it goes to prosecution or it goes to the prosecutor, then there may be interviews with the prosecutor, as well as it moving to court, and then possibly even being asked to testify in court. And through that process, it can be an overwhelming time for the victim to have to tell that story over and over and over again. And it's not, the problem isn't necessarily the retelling of the story. It's the way the story is being asked and the way that particular person, that victim, believes it's being heard. So what we know about the retelling of stories, and any of you that are listening here, that when you think about a traumatic event that's happened to you, that after the fact, you tell that story. You tell that story to your mother, you tell that story to your friend, you tell it to other people that you've come in contact with, and you tell that story over and over and over again. And I think about my own self in terms of my experience with domestic violence. And as I left that relationship, I told that story over and over and over again. But the environment that I told the story was the environment that I chose. So within the legal system, that survivor is coming in and they're being asked to tell that story over and over again. And it's not an environment that they chose. So they need to be supported in that environment. And as a role of an advocate is to help to make sure that that environment is a trauma-informed environment that works with that survivor, recognizing the impacts of trauma while they're asking the questions and creating the space for that survivor to give the answers, and has an understanding that survivor is not going to have a linear understanding of the incident that took place, of the sexual assault that took place. So when we think about that, if a person doesn't understand that the remembering of what happened is not a linear process for a victim, that practitioner within that legal system could mistakenly think that victim is not being truthful or accurate, or is just, why is this being remembered now when we talked before it didn't come up? Trauma-informed environment will understand that the memories are going to come in different fragments, and it's going to come in different ways and in different sequences. And an advocate's going to help to make sure that those practitioners are operating in a trauma-informed way, and that the survivor is emotionally supported in that process, and then we also think about how is that victim being supported, that Indigenous victim being supported in a spiritual way as well. So for example, through the advocacy that I've done over the years, there are times that we would go into meetings with law enforcement or prosecutors getting ready to go in to a court hearing, and I would pick up that victim from their home, drive them, and as a part of it, we would chat, we would talk about, answer the questions to the best of your ability. Don't feel like you have to repeat exactly everything the way you said it before. Just remember it. It's your experience, your life. And then as a part of it, we would sit in my car in the parking lot, and based on their culture, I would offer them sage, sweetgrass, tobacco, sometimes pollen. And we would sit and we would pray, we might smudge, different things like that to get ready to go into that meeting or that hearing. And then on the reverse coming out, we would sit there and it's like, let's do this first. Let's take a moment to strengthen ourselves, to clean ourselves, to spiritually center ourselves after what just happened. So that's a critical part of what we do, supporting an advocate. And then as a part of it, as we're working with the survivors, we really want to have an in-depth understanding of the systems and what can that victim expect. So if they're going into a forensic exam, I want to be able to help give enough understanding to that victim so when they're making the decision to go and get a forensic exam, that nothing is a huge shock to them. Not that I'm going to go through every single procedure, because and I won't do that because I'm not a forensic examiner, I'm an advocate, but I'm going to give enough of the high points so that they know these are the kinds of things that can happen, and that victim can say no at any point in the process. And it doesn't mean they have to stop the whole process. They can skip this piece if they want to skip this piece. I'm also make sure that as an advocate that they have access to civil legal remedies. And so what that means is they can get a restraining order or a protection order. Often in our tribal communities, in our smaller communities, that perpetrator is still in that community. And, there's times that people will come together, and whether it's a powwow or other community activity or gathering, and it may make that victim feel more comfortable to have a restraining order. So I, as an advocate, will want to know about what the civil legal remedies are, as well as being able to educate that survivor so that they can make decisions about whether or not they want to access that. And then also along the way are the community resources. So maybe they need to leave their home because the sexual assault happened in their home and they don't feel safe there. So being able to know what kind of resources are available for emergency hotel night stays or emergency shelter stay, or to help them think about how to stay at a family or a friend's house for a while. And then also to think about, so in the process, maybe there was damage to their property. So there may be community resources to be able to address that damage, and other kinds of community resources to assist that survivor. And I mentioned earlier about, I believe Hope, I didn't mention it, Hope mentioned it, about mental health. And so as an advocate, I need to be knowledgeable of the mental health resources that are available. I'm not going to make the decision on, go to this therapist, not that therapist. That survivor needs to make their own choices. But I want to know, are these therapists, do they have enough understanding about sexual violence? Are they Native specific therapists or counselors that are available in the community? And then to present those options to that survivor. And along the way, as an advocate, I'm informing over and over again. I'm informing that victim of their rights. I am informing them of the medical and forensic care that's available, the civil legal remedies, and the resources that are available. So I'm really making sure they've got complete information and multiple different options, and then being present and engaged to help them think through those different kinds of things. Next slide.
Vicki, I just wanted to add as well, when I was listening to you about really informing, I think as I was previously an advocate, a lot of the victims would come in, or they would be in such a traumatic state that they would search for these programs, but they really didn't know what the advocates provided. And I think it's important that when they initially come in, that we're informing them that, again, everything's confidential. It's victim-led, really. They don't need to take anything legal, and they can tell us what they want. We're there for emotional and spiritual support. I think that's where a lot of the victims, they're just not educated on what advocates actually do, and they kind of think it's more of the legal, on the legal line.
Right, and I think that's really a good point. And also, as you were talking, Hope, it made me think about that when we think about the trauma impact that a victim is experiencing, is that we can tell them about something at one point, and based on what else is going on around in that moment and the experience from the trauma of the sexual assault, they may only hear part of it. So for me as an advocate is that I come back and revisit things periodically, because maybe initially in the beginning, it's like, oh, no, I don't want to call the police. I don't want any part of it. It's just too big. It's too huge. And maybe they're ready to get a forensic exam. And then a few weeks later, or, even a month later, through talking about things, we can come back and revisit it. And it's like, yeah, I want to do that. And so the repetition is helpful. Part of it is maybe they're not ready at this one point. And then at other times it could be that maybe they didn't even fully hear us. And as they're thinking through things that, then what they did hear comes back, and they can process that a little bit. And I just want to share an experience with trauma with myself. And this isn't sexual assault related, but I think it's a really good example. So 20 years ago, I had cancer, and in the process of the diagnosis and making decisions about treatment, I would go to these different appointments, and I also was an advocate. So I knew how to set up things for me, because I knew things were going to get really hard and I needed advocates. So I had two other people with me in this one particular appointment I'm talking about. So the two of them came, and before we went, we had our discussion and made an agreement that when I reach the point that I feel like I can't hear anymore, then you can ask all your questions, you can do what you want. And what I found out after the fact was that about halfway through that visit, my brain shut down. I have no memory of the second half of that meeting, even though the other two people that were there with me as my support in that meeting said, yeah, you were engaged for like another quarter of that meeting before you completely turned it over to us. So while I was still actively participating, my brain said, no, you can't. We're not going to keep that. It's too much for you. So it shut it down. So you can be sitting down working with a survivor and feel like they're fully engaged in hearing things, and yet it's not going to stick. And so it's critical for us to really understand how trauma impacts victims, and particularly sexual assault victims. And that's a whole other training about trauma and the impact of trauma. But I do think it's an important point that as we're working with sexual assault survivors and victims, that it's a long-term process. This isn't something we do 2 or 3 meetings and we're done. It really is a long-term process. So thanks for getting that thinking going for me, Hope. So I want to talk about partnering, because while it's important to understand advocates, and this is basically just a snapshot of the role of an advocate and why advocates are important, that the partnerships within a tribal college campus and a tribal advocate program are critical partners together. So as you think about what we've talked about in terms of the role of the advocate and the different kinds of things advocates do, and the impact of the violence that sexual violence has on students at campus, whether that sexual assault happened on campus or off campus, or even happened a year before they started college, there's an impact playing out. So the partnership between the tribal college campus and the advocate program is a critical partnership. So when we think about it in terms of the benefits of this partnership with tribal advocates, we really have the ability to come together over some common goals. What I do know with tribal college campuses is that you have a certain mandate through Title IX and Clary to have a response to sexual assault that occurs on campus. And with that, we both have common goals. So you as campus people that are responding to sexual assault occurring on campus, you have goals in terms of how you're going to address that, and as advocates, we have goals and commitments around how we're going to address that, and there's an overlap in there between the campus and the advocate program. And with that, we have the ability to strengthen the response for the victims on campus and the survivors. And I keep using victims and survivors interchangeably. They're similar, but yet they're different. So to me, the victim is like real much closer to the incident, and a survivor has moved past that to some degree and is starting to get their feet on the ground and is moving away from that immediate crisis. And when we think about that on a campus, you're going to be dealing with both victims and survivors, because you have people who have experienced sexual violence prior to coming to college, or have experienced, maybe they've experienced within their college environment, but you don't find out about it till a year, maybe 2-3 years later. So we've got common goals with this population of people that we're working with. We want them to be successful in college. We want them to heal and recover from the violence. And with that, each of us brings resources to the table. We describe some of the different ways that advocates work, and our jobs as advocates, that's what we do day in, day out. So we're experts in terms of responding to sexual violence. And so we bring that knowledge of working with the different systems, such as the medical system and the criminal justice system, as well as behavioral health and counseling systems that can be available to survivors. And then particularly with tribal advocates, we've been thinking about how are we doing this from a tribal perspective, that we're centering our Indigenous values in that work. So as we come together, it really creates an environment where we can brainstorm and create and identify new ideas and ways of doing things that we might not have even thought about before. And as well, tribal advocates, because we're used to working with forensic examiners and law enforcement and prosecutors, and within the court systems and civil systems, that we actually already have connections with it, whereas college campuses may not be thinking about those kinds of things. And while we know that not everybody's going to get a forensic exam, not everybody's going to report to law enforcement, we still want to have those as available resources and options as well. And then critically, one of the things that's centered within our advocate work is our advocacy. The way we approach our advocacy is guided from the voices of survivors, and it's guided, each individual survivor guides it through their own experience and what they want and what they don't want. But then our experience working with multiple survivors, we use that experience to guide our advocacy. And in that, we really want to think about how those voices are focused, supporting survivors of sexual violence along the way. Next slide. So when we think about the partnerships, there's some key factors in here. So one is the common shared interest, and that we're committed to do this work together, and that we recognize that we can't do it completely without each other. So we recognize the importance of this partnership. And then another part is that we want to achieve a collaborative solution, and we're willing to be involved in doing that. And what I mean by that is that we recognize this expertise and that advocates bring that. So tribal campuses recognize the expertise that tribal advocates, the community-based advocates bring, and really want to do a collaboration with that. And as a part of it, from an advocate standpoint, we recognize that campuses, our tribal campuses, are dealing with sexual violence, and there's a population that we may not be reaching because we haven't been connected to our tribal college campuses. So there's a mutual need for each other. And with that collaboration, that solution that we can bring together is necessary with having both of us come together. And with that, we want to have the appropriate people at the table. And what I mean by appropriate people is that not every advocate is going to be the right person to sit at the table with the tribal college campus. Not every person who is involved in the response on campus is going to be the right person to sit at the table with the advocate. And we need to figure out who those right people are. So the right people are going to have an idea, a clear enough idea about the rules, the regulations, the processes that need to be in place, that the rules and regulations that are guiding us, the solutions that we're hoping, we have an idea of something that needs a solution to together. So we need to have somebody that has a bigger thinking of the sexual assault problem. So some advocates are excellent advocates at working with this victim and with that victim. But for them, when you say, well, what's the protocol for that? They're like, protocol? I don't know. I know the protocol that I follow, but I don't know how to think about another protocol. So we really want to think about bigger thinkers, but they have to have some of that core experience. And sometimes what we need is maybe not just, the campus person and the advocate person. Maybe we need a small team. Maybe we need 2 or 3 people from the campus side and 2 or 3 people from the advocate side to come together to bring those different pieces. But critically, it needs to be the appropriate people. And so for me, I want to think about is, why are we asking this person to the table? What do we want them to bring? And what experience do we want them to bring? And why do we want them to bring that experience? And then as partners, we want to have an open and credible process. So I want to make sure that in that process that we have an understanding of, why we're coming together collectively, so that we come to a collective understanding of what we want to achieve. And then in that process that we're making joint decisions together. So just as both Hope and I talked about safety earlier, and then Hope's been bringing up confidentiality, those are both, when we think about safety for survivors, confidentiality is a cornerstone of advocacy. And we want, and it's not that we don't want to share information. It's about that victim needs to have a space to speak about things that are closely intimate to them and maybe even tragic to them in a way that they believe is not going to go anywhere. So it fosters trust. So we're not going to come to the table and talk about any particular victim we're working with. That's just a clear piece in there. And that's a common understanding. We want to make sure that everybody understands. And there might be some limits that the campus has, and we need to have that all laid out in advance so that we know our limits, our boundaries. And then as we start touching on them, if we feel like we need to move past them, then we've built enough trust in our relationship so that we can work through how we're bouncing off our limits and figure out how do we work through that in a way that creates and fosters the trust and the communication that we need. And then we use skills of collaborative leadership as we're working together. So what that means to me is that I come back and I talk to you about different kinds of things instead of coming back and saying, oh, after our last meeting, I made this decision. And so here's the way it's going to go. That's not collaborative. What I do is I think about the process. I come up with the other questions that I need and become clear that we need to make a decision on this. So I come back and say, so I had some questions that came up and I know we have to have a collaborative discussion about this so we can make a decision. That's collaborative leadership. So I'm recognizing the partnership and I'm coming back in a way that we're working together to bring it to a decision. And we work together to develop those tools, those practices, and ways that we're going to work together. Next slide. So there's a lot of stuff. And in that process, when we think about, it's a great idea to have this partnership. We need to know each other. And I think about myself as an advocate program before years ago. And I used to think, well, law enforcement needs to do this and law enforcement needs to do that. And law enforcement needs to do this other thing. And why aren't they putting that all in their police report? Then I got to know law enforcement and realized, oh, well, they're not allowed to do that. Their police report, they can't write a 20-page report. It's not realistic for what they're doing, and I started to realize some of what I wanted was unreasonable based on what they were capable of doing and the parameters of their job. So it's really important for us to get to know each other. We need to get a better understanding of what we can and cannot do, what guides us, what's our overarching philosophy, what's the approach that we have. So we want to make the assumption that each other knows things, and that's just really broad. We're talking about a holistic response to sexual assault. So as a campus person who's responding on campus, I would want that campus person to make an assumption that the advocate program has an understanding about sexual assault, and I need to know what it is. So I want to learn from the advocate program. So where is the advocate program? What does the advocate program do? What can or cannot they do? Who's responding to sexual assault? What does a sexual assault response look like within the advocate program? What kind of services and resources they provide? And there's many other questions that can come up within that, but I think about it as be curious, figure out, ask the questions, get to know, go visit the program, sit down, meet with them, learn from them about what they do, and vice versa. So as an advocate program, I probably didn't even know that the campus was working on sexual assault. If I'd have known, maybe I would have reached out to the campus to learn from them. So there is knowledge within that campus sexual assault response that already exists. And so I need to assume that they know something about sexual assault But then in that assumption that they know something about sexual assault, I need to ask them about that to know the extent of that and how does that look? Because the campus sexual assault response is going to look different than the advocate sexual assault response. And if I've never been on campus, then what does that campus look like? You know, is it one campus? Is it two campuses? Is it on tribal land? Is it off tribal land? You know, what are the ways that the student population is learning about the sexual assault response on campus? And what is that response? You know, describe that for me. Help me understand what that response is. Who on campus is responding to it? Who does that victim of sexual assault or that survivor of sexual assault make the first disclosure to? And then who else might be involved? What kind of services and resources are available on campus? So when I say be curious, ask the questions. And one of the things over the years, I've worked on different collaborative and multidisciplinary teams, collaborative groups and multidisciplinary teams. And one of the things that we've done in different parts of my work is we have done things that we call observations and interviews. And so we have shadowed each other. We have gone and we have sat and done interviews, and not only do we interview the immediate responder, but I want to interview the person above that immediate responder, and then maybe even the person above that, because that first responder is going to have one view of what that response looks like. That next responder is their idea of what that response is going to look a little bit more different. Maybe they're more looking at the laws, the rules, the policies, the protocols, and then the next person, the higher up person, is going to have more the ideal picture. This is what it would look like in a perfect world. And being able to understand the different layers is also important as well. Next slide. So in building our partnership, we're going to go through steps. And ideally, it would be great if we could just jump right into the end result, but it's a process. So we want to stop first and get some clarity. So from a campus perspective, what are your advocacy needs? What do you want from the partnership? So start figuring that out, asking yourself, you know, other people that are working on the sexual assault response on campus, sit down and have a conversation about it. What would be great if we had an advocate partner? What would we want from them? What do we know from the survivors and victims we've worked with? What would have been helpful for them from advocacy? And get some clarity. And, you know, many of our tribal campuses are not going to be really big. So it's not like we're going to be able to talk to 20 people. So maybe it's 2 or 3 people. We're going to sit down and do some brainstorming together. And maybe we do it a couple times because sometimes the first time we talk about it, we struggle to figure it out. And then the second time we come back, because we've had time to think about it, process it, maybe we'll add more detail to it. And then with that, you start building your connection. So we're clear about what we want. And when we develop the connection, it's when we're starting to reach out to the advocate program. And with that, we're letting them know, what do we want from the partnership? What kind of advocacy services or consultation or whatever else might we want from that partnership? So maybe we've got advocacy on campus already, but we don't have some of the off-campus connections, such as advocacy within the criminal justice system. Maybe we want that, or maybe we want advocacy within the medical side, but we've got some of the other kinds of support to respond to trauma and emotional and spiritual care for that survivor. So we want to be really clear about what do we want specifically from this partnership. And maybe we want some consultation too. So maybe it's just not services that we want, that maybe we want them to sit in and help us think through, some policies and protocols, and maybe to help us think through some other strategies, or to bring in some training to our existing responders, and maybe even to our student population. So we really want to start reaching out to the connect and build the connection to that potential partnership. And with that, be clear about what do we want from that partnership. And then we want to agree to mutual benefits and recognize that it really is a mutual benefit in here. So through that, we want to explore the partnership and be clear about that's going to help the campus in this way. That's going to be really helpful for our advocate program in this way. And recognize that partnership as being really valuable to all parties involved with it. And then one of the steps that often gets skipped is the formalization of the relationship. People think, well, we've got this great advocate here, we've got this person we're working with, where we've had some meetings, we've built these connections, and we've turned around and we're sailing. Well, we really need to formalize it, because when we stay connected to one person, what ends up happening is when we have a turnover in that relationship, we may end up losing that entire partnership. So through the formalized relationship, we allow the sustainability of that relationship. So we start centering that in there. And then the other piece about the formalization of the relationship is we have laid out the previous steps that we went through, the clarity, the connection, and our mutual benefits in this agreement. And we're clear. So we want advocates to do X, Y, and Z, and the campus will do A, B, and C. And it's laid out in that agreement. And that's going to help us to keep working on the long haul, keeping things moving over a longer period of time. Next slide. So when we build relationships, then one of the things I see people say is like, oh, let's meet monthly. And I think the important thing is to figure out what's going to work best in this partnership. And I do think early on, there should be some agreement of some level of regularity to it. But does it have to always be the first Tuesday of every month? Or is it something that we schedule it month by month when we need it? Or is it we meet quarterly? So we need to decide, how do we want to meet, and should we be meeting, and what's going to be the focus of our meeting? Sometimes people will set the schedule and they'll forget to talk about the focus of it. So we really want to talk about what we're going to do with that time. And one of the things for me is that I think it's really valuable. So if you're going to have the advocate relationship off campus for providing the advocacy services off campus, then you really want to have a way to formalize some of the ways that's going to happen. So that's going to mean developing policies and protocols. And what I mean by the protocols is about what are the steps about, so this victim comes in, makes a disclosure that an incident happened on campus. You've got policies about what happens on campus, but at what point in this process do we connect them to the advocate off campus? And what if that, in that protocol you lay out, what if that victim doesn't want to make that connection off campus? Then what? Then do you come back at a later time and offer them that option again? Remember what I said about trauma, about sometimes we do it multiple times. And then another process of work together through meetings would be to review existing policies, protocols, and procedures. And with that, to make sure that everybody understands, and to look to make sure there's no gaps, no unintended consequences from there, and that this is going to be the most effective way to do things. And we might want to build in some training on those. So just having policies and protocols and procedures is not enough. We need to make sure that the right people know and have been trained and are prepared to follow those. And then when we think about that holistic response to sexual violence on campus, we want to make sure that what we're doing, developing, enhancing, that it's timely, it's appropriate, it's sensitive, it's respectful to survivors' needs, and that it holds offenders accountable. So those two, that end statement, the respectful to survivors' needs and that it holds offenders accountable, those two are connected together. So you can't hold an offender accountable without the survivor being able to disclose and being engaged in a process. But you want to make sure that if that moves to that point, that process is not only about meeting the needs of the survivor, but that it's responding to the fact that this particular offender or perpetrator has some accountability from what they did to this particular person through the sexual violence that occurred. Next slide. So we're creating an environment for engaging in transformative work. So for me, this work is powerful work that is taking place. And to me, it's sacred work. We have a very egregious situation that's happening to Indigenous people. Hope talked about the prevalence of violence, of sexual violence that's occurring, and it is higher than any other population in the United States. And the outcomes of that are not very good because of the lack of resources, the lack of solid responses. The outcomes are not going so well. When we think about historical and multi-generational trauma, that trauma that is still lingering from before, that trauma has reached the point it's imprinting in our DNA. And that is trauma that has not been recovered from and not healed from. So this work that we're doing, we are engaging in sacred work, not only helping this one individual engage in a healing process, but that we're also engaging in healing our communities. So we need to think about how we're doing this work, and we're doing it in a way that we're listening to each voice and perspective. We're doing it in a circle process that's respectful, that we're recognizing that we're coming to a place of carrying a collective truth. We're working together to find this truth together. And that through that collective vision, that we're finding a way when each person names his or her world and collectively describes the world. So when each person is coming in and talking about their experience and naming their world, that we ourselves collectively are describing that world in the way that we're responding in our work. So it's sacred work, and it's one of those kinds of work that if we miss the opportunity, we're continuing to feed into the historical and multi-generational trauma. Next slide. So with that, and I love this quote, it's one of those quotes that I use over and over again. So I'm going to read this to you. We are the epitome of our ancestors. They are always right here. I sit at the table with them regularly. They are right here watching me, guiding me, reminding me that I am a woman of my people. And when I think about the collaborative work between our tribal college campuses responding to sexual assault, as well as our advocates engaged in sexual assault, we recognize that our ancestors are here guiding us. They're watching us. They're watching to make sure, and they're supporting us to make sure that we're working in a way that centers all of what's important in this work, this sacred work that we're doing for our communities. Next slide. So we'll stop right here. I do want to acknowledge our contact information. Both Hope's and mine is on here, as well as we have general email addresses tribal campus at red-win.net goes directly to our tribal college campus coordinator, TA coordinator. So if you have any questions or any requests for more information, definitely reach out. You can also make a TA request on our website, on our contact us page on redwind.net. And then there's a little box which has this TA request URL in it, so you can make the request direct that way as well. So let's stop and see if there's any questions for us.
Once again, if you have any questions, you can put them either into the chat or into the Q&A section. So we have a question: any guidance or recommendations / resources for tribal college universities partnering or needing to partner with non-native advocacy programs?
Hope, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I can. So for recommendations, as far as reaching out to partners, I know like right now with working with urban programs, basically what I've done and what we've done is just do the research and search for different programs in your area. And then schedule a time to meet with them. Like Vicki had talked about earlier, is really ask the questions. I think that's the initial step into finding and building that partnership. And I think most of, there's also, you know, when you look up or Google, you can find programs in your area. That would be my recommendation as far as partnering with any of those advocacy programs, even along with tribal programs if you have them in your area.
Yeah, I completely agree, Hope. And I also think that sometimes, like if you've got a tribal program, then they'll know about, they will have a good idea about the non-native resources in the area. And with that, non-native advocate programs. And as a tribal campus, if you don't have a tribal advocate program, because I know not all tribes do, then it really is kind of like reaching out a little bit cold. It may feel a little weird, but advocate programs generally like to talk to people. I would start by asking for your program coordinator or your director. I've had a few times where I've called a non-native advocate program to just ask a basic question, and I have not been able to get past intake. So definitely ask for like a director or a project coordinator, because they can be way more helpful going directly that way versus to talk to an advocate. And I do want to put a plug in for Hope's program. So thinking about that, so Hope is our responses for urban native programs, urban native responses TA coordinator. And with that, she works in urban areas with our urban native population. So I know some of the tribal college campuses have urban campuses located off tribal lands. And so there might be ways that Hope through her work can engage and offer some support and some strategies through RTA. And then a caveat in there, often people think like, so then what does it cost? RTA is funded through the Office on Violence Against Women. So there is no charge for the technical assistance that we provide. So that would be consultations, brainstorming, problem solving, coming up with ideas. And then in some cases, it can be providing training. Do we have any other questions?
I also just put into the chat and answered the question for Raquel that online resources such as like the National Sexual Violence Resource Center has a lot of helpful information as well.
Great, thanks. Well, it looks like there's no more questions, so I just want to say thank you all for joining us. I'm really glad we had this opportunity to talk about this and look forward to hearing from you all with any questions or information that you have or requests from us.
Thank you, Vicki. Before we end this, oh dear. Before we end the session, I want to let you all know that there will be a survey popping up once Zoom closes. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you're able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. Coming up next in the series is supporting friends who have encountered sexual assault on campus on July 14th. That will be at 1 p.m. Mountain Time, just like this one. Also coming up is how to respond to students who disclose sexual assault on July 27th, also at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. In closing, I'd like to thank our presenter. I'd like to thank our captioner, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to see you all at the next webinar.
Thank you.